July 29th, 1994. A bike lies in the grass. No rider. Just abandoned. Megan Kanka, 7 years old, brown eyes, obsessed with puppies, vanished in the time it takes to cook dinner. 1 minute she's riding her bike in front of her house, the next, gone. Her mother is screaming into the darkness. The whole neighborhood is searching. Flashlights everywhere. Voices calling her name until they break. Every parent's nightmare playing out in real time on a quiet suburban street in Hamilton Township, New Jersey. But here's the part that'll make your blood freeze. The man who took her, he lived across the street. A convicted sex offender with a history of assaulting children. And the Kankas, her parents, her neighbors, everyone on that block, they had no idea. Zero. Because in 1994, there was no law forcing anyone to tell communities when predators moved in next door. 24 hours later, Megan was found dead. 89 days later, New Jersey passed the first Megan's Law. 2 years after that, every state in America had a sex offender registry bearing her name. One 7-year-old girl. One devastating tragedy, one family who turned their grief into a revolution that changed how America protects its children forever. This is the story of Megan Nicole Kanka, the little girl who loved puppies, who never got to grow up, but whose name became synonymous with child safety laws across the entire nation. This is how evil hiding in plain sight sparked the law that lives in every neighborhood today. Let's go back to where it started. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. July 1994, Hamilton Township, New Jersey. Barbara Lee Drive, a street where kids rode bikes till the streetlights came on, where nobody locked their doors, and where neighbors knew each other's names. Your typical American suburb, right? The kind of place where parents figured their biggest worry was making sure the kids were home for dinner. Megan Nicole Kanka was 7 years old that summer. She had these big brown eyes that lit up when she smiled, and man, did she smile a lot. Second grade had just let out, and like every kid in America, she was ready to squeeze every drop of fun out of those precious summer days. Her family, Mom Maureen, Dad Richard, and her siblings lived in a modest 2-story house on Barbara Lee Drive. Nothing fancy, just your typical working-class neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other, or so they thought. Here's the thing about Megan. She wasn't just another face in the yearbook. This kid had personality for days. She loved playing with her friends, riding her bike around the cul-de-sac, and she was absolutely crazy about puppies. Like, show her a puppy, and her whole face would just light up. Teachers at Mercerville Elementary School described her as sweet, friendly, outgoing, the kind of kid who made friends on the playground without even trying. You know the type, the one who'd share her lunch, who'd invite the new kid to play, who'd give you her last crayon if you needed it. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the question that's going to keep rattling around in your head as we go through this story. What if I told you that danger was living right across the street? What if the worst nightmare any parent could imagine was literally within eyeshot of where Megan played hopscotch? The Kanka family had no clue. The Smiths next door had no idea. The Johnsons down the block? Clueless. Because here's the kicker. Back in 1994, there was no law requiring anyone to tell communities when a convicted sex offender moved in next door. Wild, right? In 2025, we take it for granted that you can pull up a website and see exactly where registered offenders live. But back then, nada. Zilch. You'd know more about whether your neighbor's dog had its rabies shots than whether your neighbor was a predator. Across the street from the Kankas, at number 27, lived 3 men: Jesse Timmendequis, Brian Janine, and Joseph Cifelli. All 3 had criminal records. All 3 were convicted sex offenders. All 3 had targeted children before. And nobody, not one single parent on Barbara Lee Drive, had any idea. Think about that for a second. Every time Megan went outside to play, every time she and her friends set up their Kool-Aid stand, every time they drew hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with chalk, these men were watching. And the community? Totally in the dark. The neighborhood vibe was pure suburban America. Kids everywhere during summer break, riding bikes, playing tag, setting up elaborate games that only made sense to 7-year-olds. Parents would sit on their front porches, waving to neighbors, chatting about barbecues and Little League games. That's how Hamilton Township rolled. It was the kind of place where you'd lend your lawnmower to the guy next door, where kids would run between houses like they owned the whole block. Maureen Kanka later told reporters that Barbara Lee Drive felt safe. It was supposed to be safe, she said. Safe enough that kids could play outside until dusk. Safe enough that when Megan asked to go ride her bike, Maureen would say yes without thinking twice. Because isn't that what childhood is supposed to be? Freedom? Learning independence? Knowing your neighbors? But here's what's going to make your blood run cold. And this is the loop we're going to close later. How many other neighborhoods across America were just like this? How many other streets had predators living among families who had no earthly idea? We're going to come back to this question because the answer changed everything. July 29th was shaping up to be just another summer day. Hot, humid, classic Jersey weather that made the asphalt shimmer and had kids running through sprinklers. Megan spent the afternoon doing what kids do, playing, laughing, being 7. Her friend Amanda stopped by. They played for a while, just normal kid stuff. Nothing seemed off, nothing felt wrong. Because sometimes horror doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and ominous clouds. Sometimes it just shows up on a sunny Friday afternoon, 6:30 p.m. That's when Megan's world, and honestly, America's sense of neighborhood safety came crashing down, but nobody knew it yet. Here's the timeline, and trust me, every detail matters. Megan was outside, riding her bike near her house, right there in plain sight. Her mom could practically see her from the window. Amanda had gone home. Megan was just doing her thing, enjoying those last bits of daylight before having to come inside. Then, nothing. Maureen Kanka looked outside around 7 p.m. to call Megan in for dinner. The bike was there, lying in the yard, but Megan? Gone. Now, if you're a parent, you know that moment, that split second where your stomach drops and you think, okay, she's probably just inside at a friend's house. You tell yourself not to panic. Kids lose track of time. It's fine. It's totally fine, except it wasn't fine. Maureen started calling for Megan. Nothing. She walked outside, checked the yard, called louder. Still nothing. That's when the first ripple of real fear hit. She knocked on neighbors' doors. Have you seen Megan? The answer kept coming back. No. By 7:30, Richard Kanka was home from work, and the whole family was searching. By 8 p.m., half the neighborhood had joined in. Flashlights were bobbing up and down the street. People were checking backyards, looking behind sheds, calling Megan's name until their voices went hoarse. That summer evening suddenly felt a lot darker. Here's where I want you to really picture this, because this is important. You've got dozens of neighbors, all searching, all worried sick. They're checking everywhere, knocking on every door. And 3 houses down, across the street, at number 27, those doors stayed closed. Jesse Timendicus, Brian Janin, and Joseph Cifelli were inside. They didn't come out to help search. They didn't offer to look. They just stayed inside. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Why would they? Nobody knew these guys were criminals. Nobody knew they'd hurt children before. The neighbors were focused on finding a little girl, not profiling the quiet guys who kept to themselves across the street. The police were called around 8:45 p.m. Hamilton Township Police Department rolled up, and suddenly this went from a missing kid situation to a full-blown investigation. Officers started doing door-to-door interviews. Standard procedure, right? Talk to everyone, piece together the timeline, figure out when Megan was last seen and by whom. And here's the question that's going to haunt this whole story. I'll answer it soon, but let it marinate in your head. When did the police realize they weren't just looking for a lost child? When did this become something darker? The search intensified as night fell. More cops arrived. More neighbors joined. They brought out the big flashlights, organized search parties, mapped out grid patterns. People were checking storm drains, wooded areas, anywhere a child might have wandered or fallen. Parents were hugging their own kids a little tighter that night, whispering prayers that Megan would turn up safe. Look, if you're listening to this and your heart's already racing, I get it. This story's heavy and we're just getting started. But here's why it matters. What happened next literally changed the laws of our country. So if you're invested in true crime that actually made a difference, stories that led to real change, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we don't just tell you what happened, we show you why it mattered. All right, let's keep going. Meanwhile, back on Barbara Lee Drive, hope was starting to fade. As midnight approached, the brutal reality was setting in. This wasn't a kid who'd lost track of time. This was something else entirely. Maureen Kanka later described that night as every parent's nightmare come to life. She kept expecting Megan to just appear, maybe scared, maybe confused, but safe. That's what parents do. We hold on to hope until there's absolutely none left. By the next morning, Saturday, July 30th, this was major news. Local TV stations were running Megan's photo. The community was in full mobilization mode. People were making flyers, organizing more extensive search parties, calling everyone they knew. Hamilton Township had never seen anything like this. Sure, kids had gotten lost before, but they'd always been found. This felt different. This felt wrong. And across the street, Jesse Timmendequist was starting to crack. He'd been watching the chaos, watching the police presence grow, watching the search parties multiply. He knew what he'd done. He knew where Megan was. And he knew it was only a matter of time. Saturday afternoon, July 30th, about 2:30 p.m. That's when investigators decided to do a more thorough canvass of the neighborhood. They'd talked to most residents the night before, but they wanted to go deeper, ask more detailed questions, look for anything, any detail that might help. 2 detectives approached the house at 27 Barbara Lee Drive. They knocked. Brian Jenin answered. They asked the standard questions. Had he seen anything? Did he know Megan? Had he noticed any unusual activity? And that's when things started unraveling. Because Jesse Timmendequist was inside, and he was visibly nervous. The kind of nervous that makes cops' instincts start firing. You know that saying, cops can smell fear? It's real. These detectives had seen enough liars, enough guilty people to recognize the signs. They asked to speak with everyone in the house. That's when they met Timmendequist. Mid-30s, kind of scruffy, avoiding eye contact like his life depended on it. The detectives started asking him questions. Simple stuff at first. Where were you yesterday evening? Did you see anything? Know anything about the missing girl? His story kept changing. Little details that didn't add up. Timelines that didn't match. And here's the thing about guilty people. They over-explain. They give you way too much information about irrelevant stuff while dancing around the actual question. Timmendequist was doing exactly that. The detectives knew. They didn't have evidence yet, but they knew. They asked if they could search the house. Now, legally, Timmendequist could have said no. He could have told them to come back with a warrant. But guilty people panic, and in that panic, they make mistakes. He said yes. Inside that house, investigators found nothing immediately obvious. But they did find scratches on Timmendequist's hands. They did notice he seemed freshly showered, his hair still damp, even though it was mid-afternoon. Little things. Suspicious things. They separated him from the other guys and started pressing harder. Where were you yesterday, between 6 and 8 p.m.? His answer changed 3 times in 10 minutes. That's when detectives knew they had their guy. They just needed him to break. And brother, did he break? After hours of questioning, after the walls closed in, after he realized there was no way out, Jesse Timmendequist confessed. He told them what he'd done. He told them where Megan was. Mercer County Park. That's where they found her. In a wooded area, not far from where families had picnics, where kids played on playgrounds, where people jogged on sunny mornings. She'd been there the whole time, while search parties combed the neighborhoods, while her parents prayed for a miracle, while the community held its collective breath. The autopsy, and we're not going into graphic details here because that's not what this story's about, confirmed what everyone feared. Megan Kanka was murdered. This 7-year-old girl with a bright smile and the love of puppies was gone. Just gone. In the time it takes to make dinner, a predator had destroyed a family and shattered a community's sense of safety. Jesse Timmendequist was arrested on the spot. charged with kidnapping and murder. And that's when the real bombshell dropped. That's when investigators started digging into his background. That's when the community learned the truth that would fuel their rage and their activism for years to come. Jesse Timmendequas was a convicted sex offender, not a first-time criminal, not someone who'd made one terrible mistake. This dude had a history. He'd been convicted of assaulting children before. He'd served time. He'd been released. And then he'd moved into a house full of other sex offenders, right across the street from families with young children. And nobody knew. Not one single neighbor had any idea. Let that sink in for a minute. The Kankas had lived across from a convicted child predator and had absolutely no way of knowing. No notification system, no registry they could check, no warning at all. Their daughter played in a yard within sight of a man who'd hurt children before. And the system, the legal system, the justice system, the system that's supposed to protect us, had kept that information under lock and key. The community's reaction? Fury doesn't even begin to cover it. People were absolutely losing it. How could this happen? How could someone with that kind of record be allowed to just blend into a neighborhood? Why weren't parents informed? Who decided that a predator's right to privacy was more important than children's safety? Richard and Maureen Kanka, in the middle of unimaginable grief, started asking the same questions. But they didn't just ask. They demanded answers. They demanded change. Because if the system wouldn't protect their daughter, maybe they could make sure it would protect someone else's child. The state of New Jersey versus Jesse Timmendequas. The trial started in May 1997, almost 3 years after Megan's death. 3 years of waiting, of legal maneuvering, of appeals and motions. 3 years of the Kanka family reliving their worst nightmare over and over. The prosecution's case was pretty much airtight. They had the confession. They had physical evidence. They had forensic proof tying Timmendequas to the crime. The defense tried the only angle they really could. They argued Timmendequas wasn't mentally competent, that he didn't fully understand what he was doing. Nice try, but nah. The jury wasn't buying it. After hearing the evidence, after listening to testimony, after seeing what this monster had done, they came back with a verdict that surprised exactly nobody. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and murder. Now comes the sentencing phase, and here's where things get interesting from a legal standpoint. New Jersey had the death penalty in 1997. The prosecution was pushing for it hard. This was the kind of case that made people who normally opposed capital punishment reconsider their stance. You had a repeat offender, a child victim, premeditation, all the elements that typically resulted in a death sentence. The jury agreed. Jesse Timmendequas was sentenced to death. He was transferred to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton to sit on death row while the inevitable appeals process played out. But here's the twist. And this is where we got to talk about how the justice system actually works versus how we want it to work. New Jersey abolished the death penalty in 2007. Just wiped it off the books. Every inmate on death row, including Timmendequas, had their sentences automatically commuted to life without parole. Some people were pissed about this. They felt like justice for Megan required the ultimate punishment. Others argued that life in prison, knowing you'll die behind bars, is actually worse than a quick execution. There's no right answer here, just a lot of pain and a system trying to figure out the least worst way to handle monsters. Timmendequas is still locked up today, serving life without the possibility of parole. He's tried multiple appeals over the years, challenging his conviction, his sentence, the conditions of his confinement. They've all been denied. He's gonna die in prison. And honestly, nobody's losing sleep over that fact. But here's what makes this case about more than just one trial, one conviction, one piece of garbage rotting in a cell. Remember that question from earlier? Remember how we asked what would have happened if neighbors had known about Tim and Dequis's past? Well, the Kanka family asked that same question, and they decided to do something about it. Quick pause here, because this is where the story shifts from tragedy to transformation. If you want to understand how true crime cases can actually change society, not just entertain us, this is it. We're about to dive into how one family's grief sparked a national movement. So if that's the kind of content you're here for, real stories, real impact, real change, smash that subscribe button. We've got tons more episodes breaking down cases that rewrote the laws. Now, let's talk about Megan's Law. 89 days. That's how long it took from Megan's murder to the passage of New Jersey's first sex offender notification law. 89 days from unspeakable tragedy to legislative action. In government terms, that's like lightning speed. In normal terms, it's still barely enough time for the Kanka family to process their grief. But Richard and Maureen Kanka didn't have time to just grieve. They were too angry, too determined, too focused on making sure no other family had to go through what they'd endured. They started a grassroots campaign that would literally change the face of American law enforcement. Here's what they demanded. Communities should know when sex offenders move into their neighborhoods. Period. Full stop. It seemed so obvious, so basic, so fundamental. How was this not already a thing? But back in 1994, it wasn't. Privacy laws protected offenders' anonymity. The thinking was that once someone served their time, they deserved a fresh start, a chance to reintegrate into society without stigma. The Kankas called BS on that logic. What about children's right to safety? What about parents' right to protect their kids? What about communities' right to know about potential threats? The privacy of convicted predators was being prioritized over the safety of innocent children. That had to change. They started getting signatures, organizing rallies, meeting with legislators, doing media interviews. The community of Hamilton Township rallied behind them, then Mercer County, then all of New Jersey. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about every parent who'd ever felt that gut-wrenching fear when their kid was late coming home. New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman got on board. She pushed the legislature to act fast, and act they did. In October 1994, New Jersey passed Megan's Law, a comprehensive sex offender registration and community notification system. Here's how it worked. Convicted sex offenders had to register with local police. Their information, name, address, photo, details about their crimes would be made available to the public. Different tiers of offenders got different levels of notification. The worst offenders, the ones most likely to reoffend, triggered active community notification. Police would literally go door to door telling residents, "Hey, just so you know, a registered sex offender moved in down the street." The impact was immediate and massive. Parents could access this information, schools could take precautions, communities could be vigilant. The system wasn't perfect. We'll get to the debates and criticisms in a sec. But it was something. It was a tool. It was a chance to protect kids that didn't exist before Megan's death. But New Jersey was just the beginning. The Kankas didn't stop at state borders. They took their fight national. They met with members of Congress, testified before committees, shared their story over and over until it became impossible to ignore. In 1996, just 2 years after Megan's death, President Bill Clinton signed the federal Megan's Law. This law required all states to establish sex offender registries and to make information about registered offenders available to the public. If states didn't comply, they'd lose federal funding for law enforcement. Suddenly, every state in America had to get on board. The law was named after Megan Kanka, a 7-year-old girl from New Jersey who just wanted to play with puppies, became the namesake of one of the most significant public safety laws in modern American history. Think about that scope of impact. From one neighborhood in Hamilton Township to every single community in all 50 states. From a local tragedy to federal legislation. That's the power of parents who refuse to let their daughter's death be meaningless. That's the power of ordinary people demanding change. The sex offender registry website you can access right now, that exists because of Megan. The notification letters that go out when an offender moves into a neighborhood, that's because of Megan. The enhanced monitoring of high-risk offenders, Megan's law. The ability of parents to make informed decisions about where their kids play and who they interact with. That's her legacy. But, and this is important, Megan's law sparked major debates that continue today. Civil liberties groups argue that public registries create a permanent underclass, that offenders who've served their time deserve a chance at redemption, that community notification can lead to vigilante violence. And they're not entirely wrong. There have been cases of registered offenders being harassed, assaulted, even killed by community members who decided to take justice into their own hands. There are also questions about effectiveness. Do registries actually prevent crimes, or do they just make us feel safer? Some studies suggest that public notification reduces recidivism. Others show no significant impact. There's debate about whether making it harder for offenders to find housing and employment actually increases their likelihood of reoffending. And then there's the issue of scope creep. Some states put teenagers who had consensual sex on the registry. Some include people convicted of public urination. The registries that were designed to track dangerous predators started including people who posed no real threat to children. That's a problem. But here's what's undeniable. Before Megan's law, parents had no way of knowing if predators lived nearby. After Megan's law, they did. Before, communities were flying blind. After, they had information. Perfect system? No. Better than what existed before? Absolutely. The Kanka family established the Megan Kanka Foundation, dedicated to child safety and education. They worked with schools to develop prevention programs, with law enforcement to improve investigation techniques, with parents to teach kids about personal safety without terrifying them. They created Megan's Place in Hamilton Township, a memorial and learning center where people could come to remember Megan and to learn about protecting children. Every year on July 29th, the community gathers there. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember a little girl who loved puppies and bikes, and to recommit to keeping kids safe. Here's where we close the loops, answer those questions we planted earlier, and really examine what this case means 31 years later. Remember when we asked how many other neighborhoods across America were like Barbara Lee Drive? How many other communities had predators living among unsuspecting families? Before Megan's law, the answer was, we had no idea. The data didn't exist. The tracking systems weren't in place. We were essentially hoping for the best and praying nothing bad happened. After Megan's law, we got answers. And holy hell, those answers were disturbing. When states started compiling registries, when offenders were required to register, the numbers were staggering. There were way more convicted sex offenders living in residential neighborhoods than anyone had imagined. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Many living near schools, playgrounds, daycares, all perfectly legal because nobody was tracking it. The registries revealed what privacy laws had hidden. Predators were everywhere, in every state, every city, every type of neighborhood. Rich suburbs, urban apartments, rural communities, it didn't matter. Sexual violence against children was far more common than people wanted to believe. And the offenders who committed these crimes were often released back into society with minimal supervision and zero community awareness. Megan's Law forced America to confront this reality. It was uncomfortable. It was scary. But it was necessary. Because you can't solve a problem you won't acknowledge exists. Now, did Megan's Law end sexual violence against children? Of course not. Predators still exist. Children are still victimized. Evil didn't disappear just because we passed a law. But here's what did change. Communities became more aware, more vigilant, more educated about the risks and how to mitigate them. Parents started having conversations with their kids about personal safety, about trusted adults, about the difference between good secrets and bad secrets. Schools implemented prevention programs that taught children about body autonomy and consent in age-appropriate ways. Law enforcement got better at tracking high-risk offenders and intervening before they could hurt someone else. The FBI's National Sex Offender Registry, which lets you search across state lines and access information about offenders nationwide, is a direct result of legislation that followed Megan's Law. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006 created a more comprehensive, more standardized national system. That law was named after another child victim, another family's tragedy, another catalyst for change. And here's the thing. Megan's parents could have retreated into their grief. Nobody would have blamed them. They could have said, "We can't do this. It's too much. We need to heal." But they didn't. They turned their pain into purpose. They channeled their rage into action. They made sure Megan's life and death meant something beyond tragedy. In interviews over the years, Megan Kanka has talked about the cost of that activism, how hard it was to tell their story over and over, how every retelling reopened the wound, how they had to fight through their own trauma to push for legislation. But she's also said she'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant saving one child. Just one. That's the kind of strength we're talking about. That's the kind of love, fierce, protective, transformative love, that changes the world. Today, every state has some version of Megan's Law. The details vary. Some states have stricter notification requirements. Some have broader definitions of who must register. Some have more public-facing websites than others. But the core principle is universal. Communities have a right to know about convicted sex offenders in their midst. Is the system perfect? Hell no. There are legitimate concerns about due process, about proportionality, about the unintended consequences of public shaming. There are debates about whether registries should be public or restricted to law enforcement. There are questions about how long someone should remain on a registry and whether any offenders can ever be truly rehabilitated. These are complex questions without easy answers. But here's what we know for sure. The status quo before Megan's Law was unacceptable. Protecting predators' privacy over children's safety was morally indefensible. Something had to change, and it did. Because one family refused to let their daughter's death be for nothing. The Kanka family wants people to remember Megan as more than a victim, more than a name on a law. They want you to remember the little girl who loved playing outside, who made friends easily, who had her whole life ahead of her. They want her to be humanized, not sensationalized. They want her story to educate, not exploit. And that's why we tell stories like this, not to gawk at tragedy, not to get cheap thrills from other people's pain, but to understand how change happens, how ordinary people respond to extraordinary horror, how one family's grief became a nation's call to action. If you're a parent listening to this, hug your kids tonight. Check your local sex offender registry. Not to become paranoid, not to teach your children to fear the world, but to be informed, to be vigilant, to understand that safety requires awareness. If you're someone who survived abuse, know that you're not alone. Know that people are fighting for better laws, better protections, better support systems. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children exist because of cases like Megan's. Hotlines exist, resources exist, help exists. And if you're someone who believes in the power of activism, who thinks ordinary people can change the system when they refuse to give up, remember the Kankas. Remember that 89 days from tragedy to legislation. Remember that transformation from victims to advocates. Remember that you don't need to be a politician or a lawyer or someone powerful to demand change. You just need to care enough to fight for it. Megan Nicole Kanka should be 41 years old right now. She should have graduated high school, maybe college. She should have had first loves, first jobs, maybe a family of her own. She should have had a whole lifetime of experiences, of memories, of joy and pain and all the messy, beautiful stuff that makes up a human life. She didn't get that chance. Jesse Timmendick took it from her. But her parents, her community, and eventually her entire country made sure her brief life had lasting impact. Made sure that 7 years of life created change that will echo for generations. That's not justice. Nothing can truly balance what was taken. But it's something. It's a legacy. It's a testament to the power of love, even in the face of unspeakable evil. It's proof that from darkness, light can emerge. Not because tragedy is somehow beautiful or meaningful on its own, but because people choose to create meaning from it. The Barbara Lee Drive of 1994 doesn't exist anymore. Not in the same way. The innocence is gone. The assumption of safety is gone. But in its place is awareness, vigilance, and a legal framework designed to prevent the next tragedy. It's not a fair trade. Nothing could be. But it's the trade that was made by a family that had already lost everything and decided to use that loss to protect others. So yeah, this is a story about murder, about evil, about the worst things humans can do to each other. But it's also a story about resilience, about activism, about how one family's refusal to accept the unacceptable changed the laws of an entire nation. That's Megan's law. That's Megan's legacy. That's what happens when tragedy meets determination and refuses to let go until something, anything, gets better. Remember her name. Remember her face. Remember that she was a real kid with a real life who deserved so much more than 7 years. And remember that because of her family's fight, thousands of children have been protected who might not have been otherwise. That's the story. That's the impact. That's why we're still talking about a case from 1994 in 2025. Because some stories don't just end when the credits roll. Some stories become part of the fabric of how we protect each other, how we build safer communities, how we transform pain into purpose. Megan Nicole Kanka. Say her name, remember her story, and use that knowledge to keep your own communities safer, more aware, more vigilant. That's what her family asked for. That's what her legacy demands. That's what we owe to every child who deserves to grow up safe, protected, and free to just be a kid. Because every child deserves what Megan didn't get, the chance to grow up. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do.